In your work in the last few decades and probably longer, obviously a real polarization here of these arguments of animal versus plant, and it's become a real ideological battleground, and not just amongst the general population, seemingly amongst scientists as well. So, in your opinion and research, what do you think are some of the reasons, or even some of the nuances for this increasing polarization, which seems mostly in a lot of the Western discourse?
Yeah, that's a great point. I certainly am exposed to a lot of polarization from all sorts, researchers, social media, etc. And I think it's really driven around a few different issues. One of the largest ones for scientists is probably the environmental side of things. So, how do we sustainably produce food for a growing global population,
Mm.
approaching 10 billion by 2060, 2070? How can we do this with our limited resources? So, animal source foods often get a bad rap. Beef is often in the news for, destroying rainforest, driving all sorts of problems, greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. So that's sort of a lot of scientists are, hesitant to really kind of promote or encourage animal source foods in some contexts because of that concern. And then they're also attacked, I'm sure, as you know, from sort of the nutrition side. There's this idea that plant-based is always healthy and better, and animal source foods are kind of to be discouraged, in the West at least. It's not really the way it is if you look globally. Actually, the animal source foods are really prized for they're kind of aspirational, and they also, of course, they fill you up. They're high in protein. So this dissonance, I think, is really interesting because, in the West, if you look at most of the people who are sort of advocating for reductions or limitations or, drastic limitations or even exclusion of animal source foods, they're in Western countries. They're in the US, they're in Europe or Australia. You don't really see that in other countries. I think that's important to recognize because most of the world is actually not in high income countries. About 84% of the world are people living in low and middle income countries, and they have a very different perspective